Imagine a woman whose influence stretched across continents, not through armies or visible power, but through subtle control, through the invisible threads of decisions, perception, and the collective human mind. What if history saw leaders whose dominance was almost entirely hidden, operating behind layers of society, shaping empires and economies, wars and peace, without a single public decree? This is not a story of conquest marked by banners and battles, but of quiet, calculated influence that moved the world as if it were a single living organism, a neural network of human ambitions and fears. Her story invites us to look at power not as an obvious exercise of force, but as a distributed neurological phenomenon, where perception, psychology, and timing matter as much as armies and gold. In exploring her life, we encounter a paradox: control without visibility, leadership without recognition, influence without acknowledgement. It challenges our assumptions about strength, authority, and the very architecture of human societies. Why does this matter? By understanding how one mind could steer entire societies subtly, we understand human decision-making, the patterns of collective behavior, and the hidden forces that shape our world, often imperceptibly. When we think of history, we often picture grand gestures and monumental events. But the undercurrent, the subtle decisions, psychological manipulations, networks of trust, is where real change occurs. This queen, whose identity has been obfuscated by time, operated within the delicate interplay of perception and influence. Her domain was not marked on maps with borders or flags, but in the minds of rulers, merchants, and citizens, who acted in response to signals she orchestrated. Imagine the brain as a system of nodes and pathways. Each node represents a person, each connection a communication or influence. The queen understood the system intuitively. She did not need to command directly. She created stimuli, nudges, and subtle frameworks that guided behavior, exploiting the inherent tendencies of human cognition, our bias toward authority, our herd instincts, our psychological stress responses, and our perception of scarcity and abundance. Every letter, every decree she allowed to leak, every rumor she tolerated acted as a signal in this network, adjusting the flow of energy across the system, creating feedback loops that resulted in desired outcomes without overt coercion. To modern neuroscience, this is reminiscent of a complex feedback mechanism, where the system adapts to subtle perturbations. Her strategy was essentially applied neuropsychology across human society, centuries before the science of the mind would be formalized. Her early life is shrouded in mystery, but we can infer that her mind was exceptional. Historical patterns suggest she grew up observing hierarchy and social systems intensely, absorbing the subtle cues that dictate behavior in complex networks. She understood that the perception of power could outweigh power itself. This aligns with modern psychological research. Humans are not purely rational actors. We respond to perceived threats, opportunities, and social cues. By manipulating perception, she effectively moved entire populations, kingdoms, and institutions as if they were parts of a single organism responding to chemical signals. This is not manipulation in the crude sense, but in the sophisticated orchestration of systemic behavior. She anticipated reactions, calculated probabilities, and allowed the system's own dynamics to do her bidding. In many ways, she acted like a conductor, guiding a symphony whose musicians were unaware of the music she intended to play. Consider the famous historical events she influenced indirectly. Wars erupted, treaties formed, economies shifted. Yet her name barely appears in the chronicles. Her influence was a psychological lever. She created situations where choices seemed autonomous to those involved, but were subtly guided toward her calculated outcomes. Modern behavioral economics and social psychology provide insight into such mechanisms. For instance, she used principles akin to what we now call choice architecture, shaping the environment so that the apparent freedom of decision led inevitably to her desired outcomes. At the level of empires, small perturbations and endorsement here, a withdrawal of favor there, were sufficient to shift alliances, destabilize rivals, and consolidate networks of loyalty. It is remarkable to imagine the scale at which she applied such precision, considering she lacked the tools we now associate with data, algorithms, and behavioral analysis. Her intuition was her instrument, honed perhaps through observation, reflection, and a keen sense of human nature. Her story also demonstrates the adaptive power of human societies. In neuroscience, adaptation is a fundamental property of all complex systems. The brain reorganizes itself in response to stimuli. Societies, similarly, respond to pressures. Economic, military, social by reorganizing hierarchies and networks. She exploited this adaptive feature. By introducing subtle pressures and observing the collective response, she learned the limits and capacities of different societies, exploiting them with minimal direct intervention. Think of each society as an organism, each citizen a neuron, each institution a network hub. She applied just enough pressure to trigger desired neural patterns across the societal brain. In doing so, she was less a tyrant and more a systems theorist before the term existed. Understanding the flow of influence through networks, both visible and invisible. There is also a psychological twist in her method. Humans tend to overestimate direct control and underestimate indirect influence. Leaders often believe that issuing commands is power. This queen defied that assumption. Her strength lay precisely in her invisibility. She created conditions where her presence was felt, her will executed, yet without revealing herself as the source. This principle resonates with modern concepts in network theory. Influence often travels through nodes that are not visibly central, but occupy key structural positions. By understanding this, she effectively became the central node of multiple networks, without ever appearing as a central node. History teaches us that such invisibility can be more potent than overt authority, because it allows for adaptability, plausibility, and resilience. By not being the apparent source of power, she avoided vulnerabilities, rebellion, sabotage, or counteraction. Philosophically, her story invites reflection on the nature of power itself. Is power merely the ability to command armies, pass laws, or control resources? Or is true power the capacity to shape perception, guide decision-making, and orchestrate outcomes while remaining unnoticed? This question resonates with ideas from both Eastern and Western philosophical traditions. The Tao Te Ching, for instance, extols the virtue of leading without asserting authority, influencing without forcing. Machiavelli, centuries later, would describe the importance of perception and fortune in statecraft. This queen embodied these principles instinctively, demonstrating that the most profound form of leadership may not be visible at all. It is the leadership of the mind, the subtle currents beneath the surface of events, the quiet nudges that alter the trajectory of history. Her influence also provides a fascinating study of stress, perception, and decision-making. Modern neuroscience demonstrates that humans under stress often revert to heuristic thinking, relying on mental shortcuts. She engineered situations where stress, uncertainty, or perceived scarcity nudged individuals and groups toward predictable responses. This is not manipulation in a sinister sense, but a sophisticated understanding of systemic psychology. Every kingdom she influenced, every ruler she counseled or misled, reacted in ways that the collective psychology of the time made almost inevitable. It is a reminder that history is often shaped not by the visible clash of forces, but by the hidden interplay of perception, cognition, and subtle environmental signals. Let us also consider the metaphors of energy and networks. Imagine society as an energy grid, each person a node transmitting influence. Historical events are like signals traveling through this grid. Wars, alliances, and economic shifts are not isolated phenomena. She became the subtle regulator of these signals, damping or amplifying certain frequencies to achieve equilibrium. Her genius was recognizing that influence is not linear but systemic. By nudging one part of the network, she could produce reverberations. This is analogous to how small interventions in neural circuits can lead to large-scale behavioral changes, or how minor adjustments in ecological systems can ripple outward, creating significant environmental shifts. One might ask, if she wielded such power, why is she so little known? The answer lies in the very nature of her influence. Visibility often attracts resistance, scrutiny, and reinterpretation. By remaining hidden, she preserved the integrity of her strategies. History is written largely by those who can see and conquer visibly. The Queen's power, hidden in plain sight, defied chroniclers' expectations. She reminds us that the human mind is a complex system, and that influence often travels through subtle channels. In a sense, she was a pioneer of the science of influence, centuries before such a discipline would emerge. Her methods invite us to reconsider how we evaluate leadership, power, and historical impact. The philosophical implications extend further. If one mind could orchestrate such vast systems, what does this tell us about the potential of human cognition? Modern psychology emphasizes that humans are limited not by intelligence but by awareness and perspective. The Queen's perspective, simultaneously strategic, psychological, and systemic, allowed her to operate at a level inaccessible to most. She demonstrates the capacity for individual cognition to intersect with collective dynamics, shaping events across scales. Her life is a meditation on the interplay between the visible and invisible, the conscious and unconscious, the individual and the collective. It challenges us to reflect on the unseen structures that shape our own decisions and societies. There is also an unexpected historical twist in her story. What we often interpret as weakness, her avoidance of visible power, was in fact resilience. By appearing less threatening, she reduced resistance, encouraged autonomy among others, and allowed natural dynamics to amplify her influence. What seemed like a limitation was actually an adaptive strategy, a lesson in the paradoxical nature of influence. True power often masquerades as powerlessness, and overt control can undermine the very outcomes it seeks to secure. This resonates deeply with modern systems thinking, where leverage points are rarely the most obvious positions of force. Her legacy, though hidden, continues to resonate. Societies she influenced evolved along trajectories she subtly nudged. Institutions, trade networks, and alliances bore the imprint of her decisions, even if subsequent generations were unaware of the origin. She exemplifies how invisible influence can produce tangible, lasting change. From a psychological perspective, her story demonstrates that human behavior is malleable, responsive to context, and often shaped by subtle cues. From a historical perspective, it challenges us to recognize that history is not solely the product of overt events, but of countless micro-interventions orchestrated by perceptive minds. Her life encourages us to look beyond the surface, to see patterns, signals, and structures that others might overlook. Finally, what can we learn from her? She teaches that influence is a form of intelligence requiring observation, patience, and understanding. She teaches that leadership does not always need visibility, and that subtlety can be more powerful than force. She teaches that history is not merely a sequence of battles and declarations, but a complex web of perception, psychology, and adaptation. And perhaps most importantly, she teaches that the mind, whether individual or collective, can be understood, influenced, and guided with insight, strategy, and care. Her story invites us to consider our own place in the networks we inhabit. What unseen influences guide our decisions? What subtle forces shape the outcomes we take for granted? How might we act with greater awareness, both as individuals and as part of collective systems? As we reflect on the Queen who controlled the world without anyone knowing, we are left with profound questions. Is the truest form of power the one that is felt but unseen? Can the individual mind influence history as effectively as armies and empires? And if perception governs action, who really holds the reins of civilization? Her story is not just about history. It is about the potential of insight, the architecture of influence, and the subtle currents that shape human behavior. It challenges us to look deeper, think critically, and appreciate the invisible mechanisms at work in every society, past and present. If this story made you rethink the nature of power, influence, and the hidden patterns in history, leave a comment below with your thoughts. Reflect on the unseen currents in your own life, the subtle influences you may encounter or wield, and how perception shapes reality. Don't forget to like this video if it sparked new insights, and subscribe to Past Lens for more journeys into the hidden and fascinating dimensions of history, psychology, and human behavior.